This is Dr. Antonelli, and we are here back in Psych 101, Intro to Psychology, our class, and we are ready for our presentation on memory. This is one of my favorite topics, as many of the things that you'll hear about in this presentation are things that you probably have experienced yourself and maybe didn't actually know the names attached to it when it comes to terminology and concepts. But it's a pretty fun chapter, and there's lots of different activities within the text that you might want to kind of go through, and we might actually try to go through some of those in class as well. Okay, so basically, what will we be covering? There are a few different modules or sections of this chapter, and there's a number of things related to ways that memory has been tested, talking about errors when eyewitnesses try to make give testimony and make identifications in lineups and how they use their memory for that. And then different things related to memory, short-term, long-term working, terminology is in the first section of this chapter. So let's move on. What is the actual definition of memory? Well, memory is the retention of information, quite simply. And it includes kind of a number of, I guess you could say, categories underneath it, with some great examples here. So memory includes things like riding a bicycle and tying your shoelaces, which are also known as skills. Okay, so almost the doing part. Okay, things that you remember doing or are able to do. Memory also includes facts that never change, like your birthday. Obviously, that date will never change. Then memory also includes facts that seldom change, meaning they might change once in a while, but it's not that often that they change. For example, your mailing address. Okay, memory also includes facts that frequently change. Things that maybe on a daily basis, such as where you left your keys after you came in the house last night. Okay, and then memory also includes experiences. Some of these experiences are important in your life to remember, and some are unimportant. And then trivia. Memory also includes kinds of trivial information that you actually can't imagine probably ever using at some point in time. All right. Now, there was a German psychologist. His name was Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he pioneered one of the scientific studies of memory, and he actually used his own memory capacity to do this study. And what he did was he memorized lists of what we call nonsense syllables. And the reason he used nonsense syllables was to make sure that the material was new to him, that it was something he had never seen before, so that there would be no chance that it was something he had already learned or something that he may have already committed to memory. So that's why he was using these nonsense syllables, which makes sense. Okay, the findings of his study was that it some obvious findings, such as it took longer to memorize longer lists of these nonsense syllables, and shorter list took less time to memorize. That seems like an obvious finding. But the key to his study was that he was able to measure just how much longer, let's say, it took him to memorize the longer list versus the shorter list. In addition, he was able to kind of manipulate some conditions and analyze them as well, such as how long did it take adults versus children to memorize the lists? And then he did a comparison of memorizing some lists versus other lists, and what was the difference maybe between the lists that could have caused them to be easier or more difficult to memorize, okay, to kind of put into their memory. So a couple good things happened in Herman's studies, okay. This table often talks about this slide and the next slide. There's two slides, ways to test memory. The first three on this slide, recall, cued recall, and recognition, are what's known as explicit memory. It's where we're looking directly, at what we can actually remember. Okay, it's a direct or explicit kind of way to look at memory. So let's look at the first one, recall. Recall is where you're asked to say exactly what you remember. For example, someone would say, name the seven dwarfs. Okay, and you would try to list the seven dwarfs from memory. Other examples of recall could be something like an essay that you're asked to write after seeing a question, or short answer tests. Okay, things like, what is something, or how do you do something, like clear recall of information. Then there is another way to test memory, and that's by cueing the recall. And the cues are these kind of hints that are given to help you remember. But they're not just any hints, they're significant hints that should, in a way, jog your memory of what's being asked. So, for example, if we were to ask, name the seven dwarfs again, um, we would give a cue or a hint, such as one of the dwarfs was the one that was always smiling, one was smart, one never talked, one always seemed to have a cold. So we're giving actual cues that directly relate to the information you're trying to remember. Okay. And then we have another type of way to test our memory is through recognition. A lot of times, the recognition stands for multiple choice tests, similar to multiple choice tests, in that you're asked to choose the correct item from among several items. So, for example, the question might be, in recognition, which of the following were among the seven dwarfs? And then there's a list there: sneezy, sleazy, dopey, dippy, hippie, happy. And you'd have to pick from that list. So it's asking you to recognize something that you might have committed to memory. Okay. Another way to test memory that's also one of these direct or explicit, testing explicit or direct memory, is this savings or relearning. Okay. It's where, this process detects kind of weak memories, and then you are asked to relearn something, okay, that wasn't a strong memory to begin with. If it takes you less time than when you first learned the material, then there was some memory that was there, even though it wasn't fully there. Okay, so for example, if you're asked to memorize the list, and here are the seven dwarfs again: sleepy, sneezy, doc, dopey, grumpy, happy, and bashful. Would you be able to memorize it faster than the second list there? And that's sleazy, snoopy, duke, dippy, gripey, hippie, and blushy. Well, those obviously are not the seven dwarfs. They are similar in their idea. However, it's one of those things where, it's something that you already kind of know, maybe some of the dwarfs, the original dwarfs, and so you're able to then go back and memorize that list probably faster than you're able to memorize a whole new list, of seven dwarfs that are not the exact seven dwarfs. Okay, and then you have something called implicit memory. Okay, implicit memory is indirect. It's not a direct or explicit memory, just like the first four were, but it's basically, it takes your experiences and then it influences, those experiences influence what you say or do. So, an implicit memory example is you're asked to generate words without necessarily kind of seeing them as memories. So, you hear the story, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and then you're asked to fill in the blanks to make up those words. And obviously, you know the story of the seven dwarfs, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You know the names of the dwarfs, or have some recollection of some of them at least. And then when you go to fill in the blanks, you should be able to see from that list there that those are the names of the seven dwarfs, and you're able to easily then, or how easily are you able to put in the letters, like the first one would be sleepy, Sleepy. Okay, the second one would be sneezy, Sneezy. The third one is doc, Doc. All right, so again, it's asking you to come up with these words, even though there's letters missing. You're able to do it because in your memory you do have an idea of who the dwarfs are. Okay, when we talk about kinds of memories and how often, what's the difference between them, we talk about procedural versus declarative. Procedural memories are also kind of known as habit learning. Okay, because it's something of memories of how we do something or how to do something, such as walking, eating with chopsticks, or those are examples of procedural memories. And then we have declarative memories, which is some sort of memory that we can readily or easily state actually in words. It's more of kind of a description of something or a fact of something. So, to give you an example, if you are typing and you know to press a certain key at the right time, whatever you're typing, you don't necessarily have to be looking at the keys, you're just doing it. That could be from, that's called a procedural memory because it's something that you're doing. It's how to type without actually looking at the keyboard because you know where the keys are. That's a procedural memory. But if you're able to state in words which letter is directly to the right of C, let's say on a keyboard, that's a declarative memory. So that gives you the difference between the two. Okay. Um, how do these two differ? These two areas? Well, they really do depend on different areas of the brain. Okay, and if we were to have injury or damage to one area of the brain, it may not impair the other area. So you may have damage to an area that impacts your procedural memories, but not necessarily your declarative memories, or vice versa. Okay. The other couple of differences are procedural memory is something that will develop over time or gradually because it takes a while to, kind of put into your memory how to do something where you're practicing and practicing it, let's say. Unlike declarative memory, where again, you may just be able to know a fact or a piece of information. Okay. That could just happen in a way immediately and doesn't take time to develop. Okay. Then, procedural memory is something that's, well suited, to remembering information that we could see as true under certain circumstances, as opposed to remembering a single event. Okay, so let me give you an example. If you see a dog, and that dog has its head and its ears and its tail in like a certain position, and often that is like maybe the tail is either wagging in very quickly and the ears are kind of sticking straight up and the head is very straight, you kind of get you remember that that probably means the dog is unfriendly. It's in this position of something's going on with the dog that is sensing a bad situation, and therefore you remember that these kinds of details of the dog with its ears up and its tail in a certain position as an unfriendly kind of thing. Okay, so that's what we mean. When we apply this idea of recognizing something that we've seen in the past, they use this example of lineups in suspects in a lineup for police, let's say. When police are trying to identify who either committed a crime or was there, and they have these lineups where eyewitnesses are expected to identify the individuals who either were part of the crime, committed the crime. They do these suspect lineups. Okay, these are examples of the recognition method of testing memory. What happens is, though, is that witnesses who are trying to identify a suspect in a lineup sometimes choose what they consider the best available choice, which is not always the correct choice. For example, compare that to a multiple choice test, which you take in our class every week. Do you pick the best choice? Even if you're not certain, absolutely. You are not 100% sure that it is correct, but it seems like the best one out of the four choices when you're doing a multiple choice test. That is the same principle here. Okay, so as a result, psychologists who often work a lot with police in these kinds of applications, they have recommended ways to try to decrease inaccurate or incorrect identifications in these police lineups. Okay, for example, when there's a lineup, police should have the guilty person there, or maybe they should not have the person there, so that they can make sure that the person, the witness, is not just picking someone even if they're not certain. Okay, there should be a supervisor observing who should not know which of the individuals in the lineup is suspected. All the suspects should have the same distinctive feature. If an eyewitness said, a suspect had a certain tattoo or scar, then every suspect in the lineup should have that same distinctive feature. The observers or the supervisors of the lineup should postpone giving any feedback to the eyewitness who's trying to identify from the lineup who may have committed the crime. The supervisor should not ask yes or no questions of the eyewitness. Rather, they should ask them, how confident are you in the choice that you're telling us from this lineup? That's the person. How confident are you? Are you 90% confident? Are you 50% confident? How confident are you? Instead of saying, yes, that's the person, or no, that's the person. And another recommended way to decrease inaccurate identifications is to present the lineup of suspects sequentially, meaning don't put all 5 or 6 people in the lineup in front of the eyewitness. Bring one person, show them one person at a time, and then, ask if how confident they are that it's that person or is this the person. And then that suspect is moved out of the lineup and another person comes in, another suspect, and they do it that way, one at a time, sequentially. That will cut down on some inaccurate identifications. Okay. In these kinds of eyewitness accounts of crimes and things, children are often used as eyewitnesses. And you say, well, there is a definite difference between the memory skills of an adult and the memory skills of a child. So we have found that young children can provide some accurate reports as an eyewitness if they're asked in an unbiased way questions soon after the event. There really should not be a delay, as that will influence their answers. Okay. Several factors can actually influence how accurate these reports are when young children are involved as eyewitnesses. The first one, as just mentioned, was this delay of questioning. It is best to ask questions of the young child right away, because as time goes on and the questioning gets delayed, their accounts become less accurate. In addition, repeating the question, if the person asking the child asks the question and then repeats the question to the child often actually changes their answer, because a child's thinking is that, oh, my first answer was wrong, so that's why they're asking me a second time. And that's not always the case, but that is what happens. All right. The type of question asked, it is better to ask an open-ended question. Better, it's better than a detail, meaning the questioner should not suggest something to the child. They should ask an open-ended question like, what happened, instead of saying, did he grab your hair, for example, if a child was a victim of a crime. Instead of actually giving asking a detailed question like, did he grab your hair, just ask the child what happened. Okay. Hearing other children. Well, when children are being interviewed as eyewitnesses, they really should not have other children around, because if they hear what another child says, then that child often reports in a similar fashion what the other child said. So that's not always as effective. Using physical representations can influence how accurate young children's reports are. Like, let's say, a doll. Children sometimes may use a doll to act out a fantasy that's not exactly the truth or what actually happened. In addition, allowing children to draw is a very good way to get some eyewitness accounts from them. Okay. Children understand questions usually, but if they don't understand, they'll just answer yes. Traditionally, if a child does not understand the question being asked, their usual response will just be yes, because they don't want to look like they don't have an answer. Okay, so a couple of things to remember there, which are pretty important. Okay, this next figure kind of gives you the idea of how actually information is processed. It's called the information processing model of memory, and it reminds, or should remind you, of a computer and how the computer's memory system works. Okay, new information comes in here at the top. Oftentimes, if we either say the information again or do something with it, it goes into our short-term memory for, again, the key word is short term, short period of time, and we'll talk more about this in a second. And if it we do something with that information and over time it becomes part of long-term memory, all right, and we can either retrieve it from the short-term or the long-term memory. It really does depend on how we code it, all right. So we need to look at the next slides for that information to see how long does it stay in short-term, what do we need to do with it to get it into long-term, what do we need to do with it to get it out of memory at all. That's the retrieval piece. Okay, so short-term memory is temporary. Okay, for example, if you are playing a game, your current score in that game can be stored in short term memory. However, in long term memory, it's a relatively permanent storage. So, going back to the playing a game, it's more of the rules of the game. That's in your long-term memory because you were able to play the game 2 years ago, then you played it again, last year, you played it again 2 weeks ago and again today, and eventually you'll probably play it again 6 months from now. The rules of the game stay in your long-term memory. They become part of that. Okay, there's also two types of long-term memory. One is semantic, which is where your memory has this idea of certain facts and principles. For example, the law of gravity. We all know what the law of gravity is. So that's part of your semantic long-term memory. And your episodic memory has to do with episodes or specific events in your life that you have a memory of. For example, dropping your grandmother's vase or your grandmother's favorite vase. So semantic memory, knowing what the laws of gravity are, that's a fact. Episodic memory, dropping your grandmother's favorite vase that time when you were 8 years old. Okay. Then there's something called source amnesia, which is when you forget when, where, or how you learned something. When you know it, you might remember it, but you don't know when you actually learned it. You cannot remember the context of how or when you learned it. So danger in this is that when you don't remember the source, it's kind of like, well, where did I get that from? And what ends up happening is, and what makes it dangerous is that if you use that information, even though you don't know where you remember you got it from, and you use it to, kind of give misinformation to someone because you really can't remember where you got the memory from, that information from. Is it reliable? Is it not reliable? Are you going to pass it on as information that you know for sure is 100% accurate and factual? If you don't remember where you got it from, how you got it from, how you got it, then it could be misinformation. And then you're going to perpetuate, this misinformation that you keep talking about if you don't actually remember where and when you got it. Okay? There's only a certain capacity that short-term and long-term memory has. So let's talk about it. Short-term memory is this ability to really only have a few items at a time in your memory. And this is for normal adults, okay? And chunking is a way of grouping things into little sequences or clusters that can enable you to store much information in a short-term memory, all right? So there is a what's called a magic number 7, where researchers found that 7 letters or 7 numbers or 7 words is often what most healthy adults can keep in their short-term memory at any one time. Okay, but researchers also found, they call this George Miller's magical number 7, is that plus or minus 2 in reference to that 7 is what individuals, if there's a range of what individuals can keep in their short-term memory. So plus or minus number 2 from 7 is what individuals can keep in their short-term memory. However, if we chunk these items, meaning we group the 7 letters or we group the 7 numbers, then when we're talking about chunks, there are 4 chunks then that individuals can remember at any one time in their short-term memory. Okay, so again, there's a trade-off in the short-term memory between the number of items we can store and how accurately we can store them. We can store them actually more accurately through chunking than just remembering them kind of individually as individual letters or individual numbers. Okay. Long term memory actually has a huge capacity. A lot of times people like to say infinite, but again, there's ways that things get into long term memory that we will be talking about in a little while, and that's going to impact how much is in there and how we actually get it or move it into long term memory. Okay. Over time, memories can decay or kind of break up. Think about when food goes bad or spoils, right? Um, Parts of it may still be good, but then other parts are covered in mold, let's just say. This is the kind of thing similar to what happens to memories. They will fade if they're not rehearsed, if they're not talked about, but oftentimes they fade because new memories start happening, and they interfere with other memories. So, for example, if someone were to ask you to repeat the following letters, H, O, X, D, and F. And then I ask you to count uh, backwards by threes, starting at 231. You would say 231, 228, 225, etc., etc. And then I asked you to go back and repeat those 5 letters that I mentioned before you were doing the numbers. Most likely you are going to have difficulty repeating the letters because you had interference from me asking you to also do the numbers right after it. Okay, so that's what happens with this decay of memories if we're not rehearsing them or we have interference from something new, okay, going into our memory. Long-term memories can last for varying periods of time. Usually after a certain amount of time they're pretty stable, that they're not going to go away. They can last up to a lifetime though, and that's really an important piece of information. That's why long-term memory and getting things into long-term memory is really important. Okay. Working memory is kind of the part of the memory system that helps us to take information from short term and get it into long term. Okay, so consolidation is just a term that takes it's consolidation and converting. So you might want to remember the 2 C's. This is like a process. Consolidation helps to convert what's in our short term memory into our long term memory. But not everything in our short term memory becomes long term memory. For example, score of a hockey game that you might have been watching on TV last week is something that you might not convert from your short term memory where it was hanging out to your long term memory, because most likely there isn't really a reason for you to do that. Okay. However, if your sister had a baby 6 months ago and you were, there supporting her and helping her, that is something that you most likely will convert from a short term into a long term memory. Okay. Working memory is a system that helps you to take information you're currently learning and get it into long term memory. Another word for system that you might want to write here is sphere of attention. SPHERE. It's this idea that we have to look at what we're currently trying to learn or information we're gaining, and do we pay attention to it? Do we do something with that information? Okay, and that's where this executive functioning comes in. It's a cognitive process that takes our attention and kind of shifts it among different things that we're trying to do with that information. Okay, so we have to decide when we're learning something. Okay, are we shifting the attention among the different tasks so that we are able to get things from our short term into our long term memory? So the the biggest piece of good working memory is that you're able to shift your attention back and forth. So think about kind of multitasking. That's what this really refers to. And a good example of someone who does this is a hospital nurse. A nurse who works in the hospital often needs to keep track of the needs of several patients at once. When they have their shift, they are trying to shift their attention from one patient to another, each person having their own set of needs. And so the hospital nurse and hers or his working memory really is functioning of this with this shift of attention. Okay, it's really kind of important there. Okay. All right. The second module is going to talk about, well, now that we know all about memory and how the information gets in there and how long it stays in there and what influences it, well, um, we now try to have to encode or do something with the information. Once it gets into our short-term memory and then starts getting into the working memory and what we're doing with it, there are things that are going to influence it, and there are ways that we can organize it and then retrieve it or get it back after we've put it in there. Okay, the first there the first aspect is to talk about arousal. Arousal has to do with an emotional aspect, and it often makes coding of our memories or things we are learning or doing um, better. So, for example, okay, any sort of activity or event that's very emotional for us will definitely help to get the event we're experiencing into our memory. So, for example, your first day of college, you probably remember the feeling of excitement or nervousness if you did go away to college and your parents were leaving you there, or you were going to be there by yourself, and so on. Your first kiss is another great example of something that probably aroused some emotions in you to the point of where it made the memory stick for a long time. Or any times that you might have been frightened is another example. Okay, so memory is best for when we're trying to look at things on a list. The first items and the last items are things we tend to remember, and each of them has a name. Primacy sounds like primary, which has to do with first items. We tend to remember well firsts, things that were our first time, let's say, doing or experiencing, or the recency effect, the word recent, most recent, things that have happened to us recently in time are often also things that we tend to remember. Okay. In addition, we tend to remember anything that's unusual. Certain people could be unusual to us based on, let's say, their look or something like their name. In the text, they give you a very funny example of a woman who is tall and has red hair, and her name is Bimbo Sue Budweiser. So that particular name above everybody else's name, if you met a bunch of people that day, is probably something that will stand out because that name is very unusual. Okay. In addition, we tend to remember and encode in our memory items that are very familiar to us and have been since we were children. For example, you probably remember characters from Sesame Street like Ernie, Bert, and Oscar versus characters in maybe recent shows that you've watched that weren't as memorable for you to be able to encode. All right. There's a number of ways that when we're trying to process information to get it encoded into our long term memory, that we use this, what we call depth of processing. Okay, there's certain levels that we process information at that will help get it into memory. So, it's very important to kind of know these so that you can then be able to retrieve it, or how easily we can get it out of our memory depending on how we've actually processed it. So superficial, another word for superficial that begins with an S, is shallow. So when we do superficial processing, we're simply repeating material to be remembered. We'll say over and over again to ourselves, hawk, oriole, tiger, timberwolf, blue jay, and bull, and we'll just say it over and over. It's very superficial because all we're really trying to do there is kind of memorize through repetition. It's not the most effective way to get the information encoded into our long term memory where it will stay for a long period of time. A better way is deeper processing. Okay, deeper processing means we think about each of these items up here, the hawk, the oriole, the tiger, etc. And we try to kind of do a little bit more of an analysis. So thinking further, well, two of these items start with a T, that's tiger and timberwolf, and two start with a B, that's blue jay and bull. All right. So we try to do something with the information in a deeper way in order to try to encode it so it stays longer in our memory. And then still deeper is we do just more of an in-depth analysis of trying to, know these six terms. So three are birds, right? We have the hawk, the oriole, and the blue jay. And then three are mammals, right? The tiger, the timber wolf, and the bull. You could also make a connection that, okay, three are Major League Baseball teams and three are NBA basketball teams. Whatever kind of associations you can make are going to process the information more deeply and allow you to be able to pull it out of your memory, retrieve it, recall it more easily later on. Okay, so that's super important. You need to also have what are called retrieval cues that are kind of reminders, all right? Um, and then this has to do with the encoding specificity principle, where the idea is that any associations we've formed, like from the prior slide, at the time we're trying to learn something, those will be the most effective kind of cues that we will need to give ourselves later on. Okay, so you want to relate things you're trying to remember to things that you will then use the same things to help you pull it out of your memory. Okay, so it's really important to do that. There is a great activity in the textbook, table 7.4a and then 7.4b, where it's terms that have associations between words, and then the second chart has a blank after a term and asks you to kind of fill it in after trying to remember what kind of associations you've made. I think we're going to do that activity in class because it's a really good one, but if you want to take a look at it yourself, that would be great. Table 7.4 and table 7.4b. Okay, that's a great part of the chapter. A lot of this can relate to how you organize your studying based on what we know about memory, how it takes place, what is short-term memory, long-term memory, how we have to pay attention to something in order to memorize it, how we have to make associations in order to encode it to get it into our long-term memory. So all of those background ideas really can impact how you organize your own study habits. Some people say, well, I like to study all at once right before a test. Others say, I'd like to spread it out. Okay, well, studying all at once is actually very ineffective. It's seldom effective, no matter how hard you're studying that one particular time. You generally tend to kind of overestimate how well you've learned something, even if you've spent 5 hours studying the same topic, because you actually haven't given yourself enough time to see how much you'll forget. So most people who do this studying all at once tend to do it right before, let's say, they go to take a test, and they didn't give themselves a chance to see, okay, well, let me try to see if I know it before the test. There's not enough time in between, and you kind of try to do it all at once instead of spreading it out. So it's more effective to spread things out, and research actually backs this one up and has been proven for every kind of learning in subjects like language, math, music, sports. Research has been done on all of it and has been shown that studying all at once is seldom effective. All right. There's advantages to varying your studying. Okay, varying the conditions of studying improves your long-term memory. Let me give you an example. If you're learning to solve 4 types of math problems, okay, sometimes people will try to solve several of one type and then go on to the second type and try to solve several of those. Okay. Is that the best way? No, not exactly. It's not as good as mixing up the types for long-term memory storage. So if there are 4 different types of math problems, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, let's just say, it's better to do practice using an addition problem, then a subtraction problem, then a multiplication problem, then a division problem. See how I'm mixing them up? Instead of just, doing 5 problems of addition, then 5 problems of subtraction, and that, because you'll find that later on, again, you always want to have a delay before trying to see if it's gotten into your long-term memory. It's best if you kind of mix them up when you're trying to do the studying. Okay, taking notes during class is a really interesting one, as many of you are college students, obviously, and trying to figure out, should I be taking notes, shouldn't I be taking notes, what works for me? Well, again, the key is there's good ways to take notes and not so good ways to take notes. Okay. You want to take notes, in an organized fashion, mainly by main ideas. Okay. If by chance you take too little or too few notes or too many notes, that's actually not as good as taking, finding that balance, okay, of the right amount of notes and the kinds of notes that are going to make a difference. And basically, those are the main ideas so that you can make some associations and get it into your long term memory. All right. In addition, during this one, they found that students who tend to use laptops cannot give their attention to what they're learning, and as a result, without attention we cannot get information in our short-term memory to work through it in working memory to get it into long term. The laptop becomes a distraction because often people are surfing the web, looking up things, answering emails, and that doesn't work. All right. What you learn during testing is really important because if you test yourself before you actually have a test in class, that is much more effective because you can practice recalling the information and then seeing if it's something that you will need to work on a little bit more. Okay, so that's another good way to think about your studying. All right, there's something called mnemonic devices. Mnemonic devices are things that will help us to encode information in a special way. You may make up a story, you may attach a retrieval cue to it, and this is the one. The example that's here is an interesting one, but I want you to go back to your elementary school years and think about the PEMDAS. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, PEMDAS. This was the mnemonic device that actually helped you to remember how to do order of operations, right? PEMDAS. P stood for anything in parentheses you would do first. E stood for exponents. If there were any exponents in that math equation, right, you had to do those next. M stood for multiplication, and so on. I don't know if any of you recall that, but that's one of the most popular ones. If you're trying to remember, bristle for a traditional wedding vow, if you're trying to remember these wedding vows and you put the words into creating another word, each letter stands for something else. This is an interesting one. The B was for better or worse, the R for richer or poorer, the I and the S in sickness and in health, the T and the L to love and to cherish. And they just stuck an E on the end, I guess, to make it an actual word, bristle. Um, However, it helps you to kind of remember those traditional wedding vows. All right. So that's kind of an interesting, these devices are very interesting. Then they give you another thing within the text called a method of loci. And it's where it's on page 232. It's where you actually learn a list of places that you go to, often on a daily basis. Like you will go into your garage, then from your garage you come into your let's say your kitchen, then from your kitchen you would go into your family room, and you kind of link each place that you normally would travel to after, let's say, coming home, to an item on a list that you're trying to remember. Okay, so if you're trying to remember a list, you attach it to each of the steps along the way as you come into your house, for example. Okay, and you make some sort of connection there so that you can remember it. All right. When we talk about storage of information, okay, it's this process of consolidating, or remember we talked about on the other slide, trying to convert those short-term memories into longer-term memories and where to actually store them. Okay, if for example, it's a process where after we initially learn something, um, the way we remember things kind of changes, that we're able to then pull them back up later and keep them forever. Okay, other times they're actually going to be lost, and we won't be able to retrieve them because it depends on how we store them. So I want you to think about when you store things, let's say in the freezer. If you don't store them in a, like, let's say, vacuum sealed bag, right, things will get freezer burned, and then we won't be able to use them. We'll have to end up throwing out that food over time. That's a similar process with memories. All right, we have to store it in the proper way, or we're not going to be able to get them back and use them. All right, so these are things to just keep in mind in the process because it's very important. Okay, in order to retrieve or get things back, um, there are lots of things to think about. When we record something, remember we used to have those machines that you could record. You can do it on your phones now. You could say something and it would basically tell it back to you. Okay, that's a pretty easy way of thinking of recording it, but a lot of times it doesn't always work that way. Okay, the memories that we have don't always come back crystal clear. Something that you forget at first, you may recall later after you think you've forgotten it. Okay, it's called hypermnesia, which hyper meaning more is where you gain a memory over time. So, for example, if you're trying to recall a list, you need to go to the food store and you didn't write it down, okay, you had it in your head that there were these 10 items you needed, but when you got to the food store, you could only remember 8 of them and you buy those 8 items, but then you get home and a day later you're like, oh, now I knew what those other 2 items are, and you can recall it later on. Those other 2 items you had on the list. So that's a good example there. The other thing is that when you focus on one aspect of a memory or an event that you attended, or let's say a vacation you went on, it often weakens some of the other aspects of what you're trying to remember. So, for example, if you go on a vacation and you start describing to someone who asks, oh, how was your trip? And you start describing all the food and meals that you had, all the restaurants you visited, that's going to kind of divert your focus from other aspects of your trip. And as a result of doing that, you then will tend to forget some of the other aspects at that time because you focused on one particular aspect. All right. And then, in addition, few memories are actually recalled intact, meaning we leave out bits and pieces. We recall parts of an event, but then we may not be able to recall the exact details of something else of that particular event, and we tend to reconstruct it in our own way, okay, where we think, okay, well, this is what I think happened because in the past it happened this way. So you kind of fill in the gaps with information that, you know, is expected to really work in those particular situations, even if you don't remember the exact details of what actually happened. Okay. So it's interesting that reconstruction takes place based on, some maybe prior experiences you've had, and you fill in the blanks or the gaps with that. Okay. And when we talk about reconstruction, we can also um, use inference here, meaning we infer things that have gone on or that might relate, even if we don't actually remember something. So we infer from a list everything that has to do with a certain topic, and then we include that topic word in our list. So, for example, if there are 2 lists, let's say list A and list B. Well, list A has all of these items that are related to sleep, let's say. Okay. Um, Pillow, blanket, bed, uh, sheets, clock, whatever. It's a whole list of things that refer to sleep, but the word sleep is not on the list. But what you tend to do is, you recall that they were all items related to sleep, and so you may just add in additional items that would make sense under that sleep category. And the same thing here for list B. Let's say there was a list that had to do with candy, cookies, cake, icing, fruit, and you think to yourself, okay, what are all these things sort of have in common? Well, they're all sweets, right? And even if you don't remember everything on it, you remember the general idea or gist of something, and that's that everything on that list seemed to like have to do with being sugary or sweet of some sort. And as a result, you might fill in some gaps of other things that would probably fit on that list just because they fall into the category of sweets. All right. This reconstructing ideas or filling in the gaps has to do with some stories. When you're telling stories or you're trying to, recall a story and then tell it, you also tend to remember the really unusual parts of the story or the distinctive parts of the story that set it apart from other things the best. Okay. If someone has a memory of a story that's not so clear anymore, it's kind of faded. They kind of rely on the general idea, which is also known as the gist of the story, and they'll kind of not give details that are irrelevant. They'll add things or change other things to fit how logical it would fit in the story. So the less certain your memory is on events or specific details in a story, the more you're going to rely on your expectations for, well, this really should be part of the story, or this makes sense if I put it in the story. All right. You've heard people say, oh, what was that time when you did this? Tell me the general gist or the idea of the story. Like, that's what people ask for. And again, it's you fill in those gaps. All right. There's another concept called hindsight bias. We all know what hindsight is. It's like, you've heard the phrase hindsight is 2020. When you look back on something, um, and you kind of get the idea of, okay, I guess I should have done it better this way. Hindsight bias is going along with the phrase, I knew that was going to happen. We tend to mold, how we remember the past, to fit how the actual events eventually happened. Okay. So this occurs for a number of reasons. We kind of would like to think the world is very orderly and predictable, and that if we have like this basic story, we could see that, okay, this is the prediction, this is what's going to happen at the end of that story, no matter what. We all know that that doesn't happen. That's the first one. We confuse the facts we know now with those we knew earlier. Which may not be too many, but again, there is a bit of confusion because when we were experiencing an event, we didn't have all the facts. And then after we did, and we kind of put them into the story, even though they really didn't happen that way. Okay. And then we tend to focus on facts that, we knew earlier that fit with the later outcome, but we tend to not then put the ones in that now don't fit, even if they actually happened. Okay. Hindsight bias often occurs in things like legal cases when they're trying to make judgments on things, in legal cases. For example, medical malpractice. That when a doctor who's practicing medicine makes, a diagnosis, and then the diagnosis is not correct, and the patient is given a treatment that either does not work or some, um, you know, unfortunate outcome happens. Was it really clear at the time what the correct diagnosis was, or did this hindsight bias almost kind of cloud our vision a bit? That's one of the good examples that they use in the book. All right. And then the last section kind of talks about forgetting and amnesia, and some, different kinds of conditions that, lead a person to be unable to remember certain things. All right. This idea of retrieval, and interference, when we try to retrieve or get our memories, to be able to tell a story, retrieve information, a lot of times we can't. We forget. This the interference of other things keeps us from remembering certain things. It leads us to forgetting things. How does this actually happen? Well, we have what we call proactive interference. This is where, you know, we learn something, let's say A, we learn A, then we learn B. And then we tend to forget B because A has interfered with our learning of B. That would be proactive. Retroactive is actually the reverse. It's where we first learn A, then we learn B, but then we forget A because B interfered with it. So it's like that idea of when we're trying to learn, two maybe things at once, in a certain order, and one is interfering with us remembering the other one. Okay, interference is a major, major cause of forgetting information, and we have to remember that that's why it could be happening. Okay, there's always been a controversy as to, well, can therapists help people through hypnosis? Remember in chapter 10, hypnosis? Can therapists help people through hypnosis recover certain memories, especially memories of painful experiences? or not. That's been the controversy. Well, again, this idea is known as recovered memories. However, many researchers kind of doubt, and there's, of course, very little supporting evidence as well to support that therapists or anyone doing hypnosis can actually help to recover memories that have been, hidden or stored away so well that we can't get them back, or we can get them back. It research hasn't proved that. It's the difference is that if someone spontaneously remembers something without the help of a therapist or hypnosis, then usually we can find evidence that that particular event did happen in that person's life. However, when therapists or the use of hypnosis tends to pull out what we call recovered memories, those memories we often can't find proof for or evidence of that they actually happened in that person's life. So there's a clear distinction there. Okay. There's also this idea of traumatic events, and having a memory of traumatic events. And does this really happen? Or has someone influenced, or suggested something that might have happened, and therefore that person now thinks that that actually did happen to them? That's what we're talking about here. Repression, we're going to talk a bit more about repression in chapter 14 because it has to do with Freudian theory, where it's moving of an unacceptable memory or impulse from the conscious mind into the unconscious mind. That was the term that we used to refer to that as under Freudian theory, but now currently clinicians tend to use the term disassociation instead of repression. And disassociation has to do with a memory that, one person has stored but cannot retrieve. They have it kind of locked away somewhere, and they've disassociated the rest of their memory from that. Okay. So again, there's some things that influence whether a person actually remembers a traumatic experience, and that's the timing of the event. Most events that someone remembers that are traumatic, if they happened when they were younger, it's not as likely that they'll remember it as things that happened to them when they were older. The severity of the event, how severe it was, or if it was repeated often, the traumatic event, and how the other family members react, and the reaction that they had often impacts how someone remembers a traumatic experience. Whether the family members were supportive or encouraging or not will impact whether someone remembers a traumatic experience. Okay. There's also something called a false memory, which is obviously a not correct or inaccurate report that someone believes to be a memory. And oftentimes this happens when someone is misled by an experimenter who's, let's say, asking them questions or repeating suggestions of a past event that might have happened in someone's life, or the experimenter is asking some very misleading questions, and then as a result, that person oftentimes thinks that really happened to them when it really didn't. Okay. Then the last couple of slides here talk about amnesia, and amnesia has to do with a loss of memory. It's not a loss of everything that a person has ever learned. That is often referred to as dementia, where someone forgets how to walk or talk or eat. That becomes known as dementia, not amnesia. Amnesia results from many kinds of brain damage, including damage specifically to the area of the brain known as the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is an area that is very, very important for the encoding and the retrieving of certain memories. Okay, it's a large area in the forebrain structure, in the temporal interior of the temporal lobe, which we've talked about the brain in the other chapter. But again, that just shows you where it is, and that's often damage to that area is what results is amnesia. Okay, there was a patient named Henry Molaison, also known as HM, and that person is referenced in the text as HM. In 1953, that patient had their hippocampus removed because they were experiencing severe seizures. And when he had his hippocampus removed, they were able to see this kinds of loss of memory with amnesia. And there's a couple of different kinds. This Enterograde amnesia is where the individual is now unable to store new long-term memories. In the case of HM, he kept saying that it was 1953 and he was 27 years old because he could not uh, store any new long term memories. And then there's retrograde amnesia, which is someone who loses their memory of events everything that happened before their brain had been damaged, before their hippocampus had been damaged. So oftentimes that can happen a couple of years before the brain damage, they lose everything, or much before that, they will also lose a lot of their memories. Okay. Um, Patients with damage to the hippocampus often have a number of difficulties with storing. They cannot store, factual or declarative long-term memories. They have trouble with past events or episodic memories, even though they can form normal short-term and procedural skills, things that they know how to do, the how, and habits. They can actually do that okay, and form some of those kinds of habits and memories. All right. It's very important because the hippocampus serves many functions. And one of the things that the hippocampus does is to kind of take all the details and the surrounding events or context of something and kind of bring it all together. Okay. Um, if, for example, someone does not have their hippocampus intact, if there has been damage, then they tend to they're only able to remember kind of the general ideas of an event. They won't be able to remember a lot of specific details. Okay, so that's interesting after that. Um, in addition to damage to the hippocampus, we have damage to the prefrontal cortex can also produce amnesia. Okay, this can happen as a result of a stroke or head trauma or something called Korsakoff syndrome. This is a condition where if you have a deficiency over a long period of time of vitamin B1, um, which leads to shrinkage of neurons. We've had a discussion of neurons and their importance in carrying messages. Well, if we have this deficiency of vitamin B1, then we often have this syndrome called Korsakoff syndrome, which again can produce amnesia due to damage to the prefrontal cortex. So it's one of those things to, again, just information about amnesia. Um, Patients who have this prefrontal cortex damage, they tend to use something called confabulations, where they fill in um, gaps in their memory, pieces of information that are missing from a story or from an event, and they tend to just fill in those gaps with other things that they just may know from experience. Okay, so they often answer a question about what's happening today by describing something from their past. Even if it doesn't make sense, they'll continue to say, "No, this is correct," because they're using information that they knew from a long time ago, and they're saying that it applies to today. That's what patients, with this kind of damage often do. Okay, we have another area of memory impairment called Alzheimer's disease. Many of you may have heard of Alzheimer's disease. Prior to the age of 60, when we have onset Alzheimer's prior to the age of 60, we have a genetic and genes that can help explain that. However, Alzheimer's disease traditionally is a condition occurring mostly in old age, where there is an increasing severe memory loss. There's often confusion and depression, disordered thinking, and inability to really pay attention to things well or for long periods of time. Individuals with Alzheimer's tend to, have memory problems. More often, their declarative memory is more is affected more than their procedural memory. So they often are able to learn new skills. That's the procedural memory, such as how to use a cell phone, but they may not know too much new information or have trouble remembering new information, declarative memory. Okay, so that's kind of the idea behind Alzheimer's. And then the last slide talks about early childhood amnesia, and what this has to do with um, is not necessarily young children having amnesia, but individuals having um, very little memory of when they were younger. Okay. It is something that almost all of us experience at some point in our lives. And it's, you know, because of, you know, this formation of neurons early in life is what, as they were moving along in our early years, we were able to learn things very quickly because neurons were constantly being formed. And so when we form new neurons, in our younger years and our early childhood years, those new neurons would often replace older neurons we had at that time. And as a result, we would lose some of the memories that we had stored when we were younger. And therefore, we can't necessarily remember these things later on because those neurons had been replaced by newer neurons. All right. So, all of these ideas related to memory, some disorders, some conditions that cause us to not remember things, and it's a very interesting chapter with how we can, in, you know, through our short-term memory, then our working memory, then our long-term memory, encoding information, storing it properly, and then retrieving it when we need to, and some of the issues with retrieving information. So great chapter, some activities in there. Hopefully when in class we'll be able to do some of those activities. All right. Okay, I'll see everyone in class. Thanks.